Welcome to From the Mind of Christine McConnell. In today's episode, we are going to craft a trick medicine cabinet that has a view into the next room. So with that said, let's begin. I want to create a pathway from my bedroom out into the hallway. And this is kind of the very best spot because obviously it's a big, huge hole. And the one place that you're never really going to mind a hole is directly behind a sink where there's always a mirror. So it didn't even occur to me that this was a possibility, but this wall is solid brick and 11 inches thick. So I don't know, it's the very best wall in the house to do this. So for that reason, I'm just going to figure out a way around this obstacle and move ahead. So obviously I'm not an expert at cutting big holes into brick walls. So this is going to be a little bit of a learning curve for me. Essentially what I figured out was I don't want to create a massive amount of dust or mess from an oscillating tool. So I'm just going to drill a bunch of holes along a perimeter and then just connect those holes one at a time. It's going to take a lot of time, but it is going to get the job done. I don't know why, but something about doing this with a drill just makes me think my dad's going to come into the room at any minute and get mad at me for using his tools to do to do something ridiculous. The first layer I'm dealing with is really just kind of a strange plaster. I'm assuming it's the stuff that they would use for lath and plaster. The very first face of it is normal, like plaster of Paris that I've used before, and then beyond that is this really gritty cement kind of stuff, and it's got little bits of horsehair and all sorts of strange stuff going on in it. I was desperately trying to minimize the mess and the dust, and it was just kind of a lost cause. This was a ridiculously messy project. I've always had this dream of getting into like marble sculpting and seeing what I could create with stone, and this particular craft cured me of that desire. I realized it is incredibly hard on your hands to use a chisel and a mallet, and it is not something I would want to do again. The very hardest part of this was that initial pass through the wall, and then once I had achieved that, the rest was much easier. This Victorian-themed wallpaper was installed in the 80s, so don't be too sad about it. I already have plans to take it away and replace it with something incredible. At some point, I just gave in. That drill idea was just was not functional, so I finally did break out an oscillating tool to start cutting this opening to be a little bit bigger. To reduce as much of the dust as I possibly could, I just kept a vacuum attachment right next to it, and that did seem to dampen down most of the damage. Okay, so initially I was imagining this hole just needing to be kind of like the size of my face, but given how thick the wall is, I realized I'm gonna really have to be able to get in there. So this is gonna need a much larger hole. And for that reason, I'm just going to take a few quick safety precautions to ensure that this wall doesn't lose any of its stability. I'm going to install a lintel on both this side of the wall and the other side. And essentially what that is it's like a long plate of metal. And so what you do is you drill out the grout along the line above where you're working. And then you tuck this in. And basically what it does is it supports all of that weight above and just keeps things balanced. So at no point is there any possibility of these bricks coming tumbling down. I'm using a masonry caulking, and basically what this is it's got a little bit of elasticity and squish to it because I guess we talked to our brick guy and you don't want to use something incredibly rigid like a plaster. And I guess that prevents the bricks from being able to slightly move the way they naturally do. And so that is the reason I'm using this. And by the way, you did not want to get the stuff on your fingers. It was really tacky and messy and difficult to work with. I'm now installing that lintel again on the back side before I start removing any of these bricks. It seemed like every brick after that first one was much easier to remove. It was just that first one that really didn't want to give. I cleaned up all of the edges as best I could with this oscillating tool, and then once I had gotten it to a pretty good place, then I went and mixed a batch of plaster and sealed everything up. And while we're right in the middle of this, I might as well just admit to you there were a few moments where I was like, oh my God, what have I done? I've just torn a hole right in the middle of this house. But when you see what this looks like finished, it is absolutely worth it. All right, the hole is all done, and now I need to head up to the attic and start building a frame for this cabinet. I began by marking all of my cutting lines on these two boards. The boards are a little bit wider than they need to be, so I'm going to have to skim those down a little bit and then cut where all of these lines are drawn. Earlier this year, I did some serious woodworking on the exterior of the house that is going to be coming in a future episode. And so I had to get this bandsaw to do all of that. And so now I'm just finding it has all sorts of amazing uses. Before I could connect any of these pieces, I needed to ensure that they were perfectly square because the last thing you want to do is get in there and realize your box is a little bit wonky. The very first thing I did was glue and then use brad nails to kind of get it together. And then once it was feeling pretty secure, then I pre-drilled and added a bunch of pretty heavy-duty screws so that at no point could this thing wiggle or lose shape. It's now time to install, and I'm not even going to show you how many times we filmed this exact shot and it didn't fit. So This is the money shot where everything worked out. I double checked to make sure that it was square and level, and then once I was happy with everything, then I used a construction caulking to just fill in this gap. I want this cabinet to swing outward, and so to clear the frame, it's going to have a curved back, and so that is what we are going to tackle right now. To figure out what that curve needed to be, I just took a piece of construction paper, measured it to the exact width of this cabinet, and then I just kept bending it and kind of seeing what that shape would need to be in order to turn cleanly if the hinge was here on my left-hand side. After I cut out that shape, I tested it in the spot and it worked perfectly. So normally I would have cut out this shape with a jigsaw, which is what I always use, but the captive had gotten this CNC machine several years ago to work on a project, and we really have not used it much since. And he was sort of the proponent of, if you use this method, you're going to get something that's perfectly uniform. And I needed 3 identical shelves, so we did go with this, and the end result was beautiful. So if you have something like this, it is pretty terrific if you need multiple pieces that are identical. I smoothed all of the edges using the sander that we had gotten for that roof project, but you could easily use a palm sander or even just sandpaper in your hand if you needed to smooth this out quickly. I cut the back piece using the bandsaw, and then the edges needed to be kind of curved on the back, so I smoothed those out using that sander again. Once all of my pieces were looking great, it was time to start assembling. So the way I did this is I set up that square, used a little strip of glue, and then just brad nailed to start. To really add some security, I pre-drilled several holes on the back and then drilled in deck screws. I needed a couple pieces of board that would hopefully bend a little bit when saturated, and so we took some of that plywood that I had left over from making the haunted painting, and we just put it in the CNC machine and had it cut out these like beadboard patterns. And then once that was done, I had to cut those pieces up. Initially, I tried steaming this and very quickly realized that was just that was not going to cut it. I needed to actually fill up the hot bathtub and let them soak overnight. In the morning, they were feeling a lot more flexible, thank goodness, and so I started by brad nailing down the beginning of it and then very slowly bending it one little panel at a time, nailing it in all the way across on all 3 shelves. And then I just gradually did that all the way until I hit the back. To add some additional security, I did the same thing here with pre-drilling and putting in those deck screws. Once I had it together, I realized the face of it needed a little more stability and structure, so I cut out these bars, and I'm going to be fusing and gluing these into the front and sides just to really kind of lock this thing all together. If I was going to do this project over again, I would do this step before adding that beadboard because it would have made that whole process go a lot nicer. To make the back look really uniform, I took some of that extra beadboard and cut a panel and glued and then brad nailed it to the back of the cupboard. I let it dry out and set overnight, and then in the morning, I undid all of those clamps and sanded everything smooth. It's now time to add the hinge, and the way that I did this was I marked it on the cabinet first, and then because I don't want the hinge to take up too much real estate, I'm actually going to Dremel out a cavity so that it rests flush within the cabinet. Now it's time to affix it to our casing and cross our fingers that this worked. Okay, so that was really complex and it took a lot of figuring out to get that to work properly, but the finished result is just so beautiful. And now what I need to do is take that antique mirror that was hanging above the sink and alter it just a little bit so that it can work on a hinge. The way that I'm going to start this is by building a frame initially, and the reason I'm doing this is the sides of this mirror are not perfectly straight, so if you just put them on a hinge, they wouldn't they wouldn't turn at all because little points would be stopping them from moving. And so it needs to come far enough away from the wall that it can clear that easily as it turns. And so once I've got this frame built, then I can actually affix it to the back of the mirror. I found this mirror at a thrift shop several years ago when I was making over the guest room and I was just looking for pieces. I got an absolute steal on it because the mirror part of it is pretty worn down and kind of just not looking its very best, but I personally love things that look old, so it worked out really well. The only issue is the backing of it is kind of falling apart, so I am going to have to create a fresh backing. I absolutely love hiding little secret messages all over the place just because I don't know what's better than like talking to somebody from the past through whatever it is that you've uncovered. And so I do that often and as much as possible. Oh, and just so that I get a tiny little bit more extra storage, I'm making a few shelves here in the back because there's this empty cavity. Our mirror is looking really great, and now the next step is going to be to create a frame on the wall that mirrors this and actually gives it something to attach to. To affix this frame in a way that it really holds, I'm going to pre-drill out some holes and pop in some masonry plugs, and when you screw into this, they expand and it just completely grips. It's almost impossible to pull off. To mask some of the destruction caused by making that hole and just give this whole cabinet like a really beautiful backing, I'm going to use some beadboard that I had left over from when I did that coffered ceiling in the den, and I'm going to use this just to line the back and give it a nice uniform look. It took a few practice cuts to get this piece to wrap around the cupboard in a nice pretty way, but once I got it there, I used an industrial hot glue gun to fuse the pieces in place, and then once they were set, I used a brad nailer just to add a little bit of additional security. Okay, so this might sound a little bit silly, but the beadboard that I stacked here came to the exact width that it needed to be. I didn't have to cut it, I didn't measure anything, it just worked out. And when you do these projects, there are so many obstacles and so many things go wrong that when something goes this right, it's almost kind of eerie and feels maybe a little bit supernatural. So now we get to actually hang our mirror on this frame. I started by attaching a piano hinge to the mirror first, and then from there I was able to affix it to the frame that I had built on the wall. And then added a magnet closure, and then it was the moment of truth. It was perfect, and now I can move on to staining. I needed to use a liquid stain on this because that was what I had and it's what matched the mirror. So it was a little bit more finicky to work with, but it definitely did the job and it matched perfectly. Something I love so much about this is now there's all of this extra storage in this room, and obviously there is a hole here on the stairwell wall, but there's always going to be pictures all over here, and anyone in the future who for some reason didn't like the painting that's here could just replace it with some other image. Now for the trick part. To disguise what this cabinet actually can do, I'm going to create a rectangular frame, mount it with a hinge on top, and install a magnet on the bottom so that when you need to use it, all you have to do is lift up this frame and pull out the cabinet. And then when you're not using it, you just close this all up, and nobody is ever going to be any the wiser as to what this thing actually can do. I wasn't actually entirely sure how I was going to conceal this, and this idea for this frame kind of just popped into my head. Late at night, the captive had already gone to bed, and I got so excited, I went up to the attic and I started cutting wood, and it just came together so beautifully. So I don't have a lot of making of footage for that reason, but the finished result is just perfect. And it is all finished, and I've just got to tell you, when I realized that was a solid brick wall, my heart sank just because I wasn't entirely sure that I was going to be able to make that work. But ultimately, the depth worked to my advantage because now not only does the house have this amazing creep feature that every house should have, but in addition to that, I now have a ton of storage right here in my bedroom sink. So I hope you've enjoyed this and that you and all of your ghouls and goblins have a very happy Halloween.